We should start this part of the course by discussing the one main change that occurred during the early Persian period. We don't have any archaeological proof for it, and all we have is a description in Ezra chapters 1 to 6 and a description in the prophetic literature. However, the place of this change in the national memory is so strong and prominent that we have no reason to doubt that it actually happened. Let's start from the beginning. The central place of Jerusalem as the hotbed of ceaseless religious and political turbulence motivated the Babylonians to raze it to its very foundations. The city remained desolate and deserted for 47 years until the Persian period. It may be assumed that this situation was the outcome of specific instructions aimed towards keeping this rebellious city empty and desolate. As for the status of the temple after the destruction of Jerusalem, even though archaeological finds cannot help here, and the description in the second book of Kings, chapter 25, verse 9, is general, permitting various interpretations and reconstructions, no doubt need to be cast on the assumption that the temple was destroyed and ceased to exist. The temple was rebuilt after a break of about 70 years, and we should compare it to Haggai chapter 2 verse 3 or Ezra chapter 3 verse 12. It is uncertain, however, if the Babylonians wished to prevent or could have prevented pilgrimage to the site of the ruined temple. Perhaps the pilgrimage even served their purpose, in that the pilgrims saw before them the fate of the rebellious city and the punishment of those who relied on the eternal protection of their God. Some scholars have hypothesized that the absence of a specific reference to the destruction of the altar by the Babylonians may hint at its continued existence. This reconstruction is hard to accept, being based on the silence of the sources and on the assumption that the altar was a massive structure whose demolition would have required a planned operation. The account in the second book of Kings, chapter 25, verse 9, is short and very general, while the list in verses 13 to 17 centers on the copper, silver, and gold vessels. Still, the impression from these descriptions is distinct, and it accords with the absence of reference to any ritual activity at the site of the destroyed temple, also in the other sources that treat this period. There is even an express statement about the desertion of the altar, and I can read it from Lamentation chapter 2 verse 7. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary. The only testimony about the fate of the temple after the destruction of Jerusalem is an account of the arrival of 80 pilgrims for Shem, Shiloh, and Samaria. And I'm reading from Jeremiah 41, verse 5. With their beards shaved and their clothes torn and their bodies gashed, bringing cereal offering and frankincense to present at the temple of the Lord. The destination of the pilgrims is indeed not stated explicitly, but we should assume that it was the ruins of the temple about 2 months after the destruction. They brought cereal offering and frankincense, an evidence of non-animal sacrifice. If this story was based on an historical memory, we can reconstruct that soon after its destruction by the Babylonians, the site of the temple became a focal point for pilgrimage, with many coming to pray, to recite laments, and to bring offerings to the god. No evidence exists of formal Babylonian sanction for the holding of any kind of ritual. The pilgrimage to the site of the ruined temple appeared to have been made by small groups or by individuals, and the ritual conducted there was popular and spontaneous. The Babylonian government didn't bother to ban or prevent it, apparently because it suited its interests to demonstrate to all the fate of whoever rebelled against it. Support for this reconstruction may be found in the report in the second book of Kings, chapter 25, verses 18 to 21, and in Jeremiah 52, verses 24 to 27. According to this description, Seraiah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second priest, and the 3 keepers of the thresholds were put to death by Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. Just as the execution of Zedekiah and his sons was intended to terminate the rule of the house of David in Judah, the elimination of the priests seemed to have been intended to terminate their status and their influence on the center in Jerusalem. But in contrast to the information on the appointment of an alternative leadership, not from the Davidic dynasty, like Gedaliah the son of Ahikam in Mitzpah, nothing is known of the appointment of priests in Jerusalem or elsewhere in Judah from a different family. This point reinforces the assumption that formal ritual practices were not laid down in Jerusalem, and that with the introduction of such practices in the Persian period, the family of Tzadok re-established its position. If the narrative in Jeremiah 41 verse 5 reflects actual history, a central theme is the bringing of cereal offering and frankincense and the lack of evidence of bringing animal sacrifice. The parallel in terminology and in the historical processes to the circumstances that emerged from the Elephantine papyri has been conspicuous to many scholars. For the Elephantine temple too, the Jewish temple in Elephantine, was destroyed in 410 BCE and lay in ruins for some time. The grief over the destruction of the temple was heavy and continued long, together with the submission of petitions for license to restore the temple. Eventually, in 407 BCE, instructions were received from Bagaviah, the governor of Judah, and Deliah, the governor of Samaria, that the Jews in Elephantine could rebuild the temple and resume there the bringing of cereal offering and frankincense. This license didn't include permission to offer animal sacrifices, which apparently was restricted in this time to the temple in Jerusalem. Despite the interval in time between the 2 destructions and different circumstances of the 2 cases, and the apparent difference in the reasons why the imperial authority prohibited animal sacrifices, the inferiority of the status of the temple where cereal offering and frankincense were allowed to that where animal sacrifice was allowed become clear. No information exists on events in Jerusalem between the time immediately after the destruction and the restoration period. Nevertheless, the perception that the status of the ritual in Jerusalem was a result of Babylonian policy required the assumption that any change in the status of Jerusalem, of the temple in Jerusalem, would have to be connected with a change in policy. Considering the assumption that the temple in Jerusalem was not restored in the period of Babylonian rule, and that limited ritual activity continued at its ruined site, we may understand the great innovation and the legal importance attributed by the returnees to Zion by the Babylonian Judaism community to the decree they got from Cyrus. Unconnected to the question of historical veracity of the decree as presented in Ezra chapter 1 verses 1 to 4, the different policy of the Persians was presented as a legal basis for the building of the temple and the renewal of the offering sacrifices in it. In the first year of Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt on the place where they used to offer sacrifices, or if you'll go to Ezra chapter 6 verse 3 in the Aramaic decree, it stated at the end, as a place where sacrifices are offered. From the account in Ezra chapter 3 verses 1 to 5, the rebuilding of the altar and the renewal of the offering of sacrifices there were also the first acts accomplished by the returnees to Zion. According to Ezra chapter 3 verse 6, and I'm quoting, from the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. The temple was built 23 years after the declaration of Cyrus and the first return to Judah. This is the first and main change in the history of the land under Persian rule. It was a clear Persian interest to allow the different communities in Babylon and in the other parts of the empire, including the Judean community, to rebuild its temple and to gain its loyalty. Another aspect of the same Persian interest was the permission to the representatives of the old elite, including those of the Davidic family, to become the governors in Judah and to make sure that also this part of the empire will remain quiet and loyal. If you will think about it for a minute, so the Persians did exactly the opposite of what the Babylonians did less than 50 years before them. Instead of destroying the city and the temple and to exile the Davidic family as well as the priesthood to Babylon, they allowed representatives of these families to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, and to renew the cult. The question is if this change in the history of Judah and the Judeans came together with others, more practical, like a change in the geopolitical situation in Judah or change in the settlement policy. This will be the subject of the next units in this last part of the course.